Hello, and welcome to a short historical overview of Second Wave Feminism, which is a historical term that we use in order to try to distinguish the different waves of feminism that hit the United States. Really, what this is a way to separate the feminism that we see in the 1960s, 1970s, and early 1980s in the United States compared to first wave feminism, which is really associated with the suffrage movement in the 19 teens and culminating in 1920. To a large extent, please understand that those are arbitrary um, labels that are totally artificial. So when we talk about second wave feminism, we're talking about something that really starts circa, I'm just going to say 1963, but you could certainly go a little bit earlier if you wanted to. One of the most important figures to note with second wave feminism is Betty Friedan, who published a book titled The Feminist Mystique. The book argued that women were not satisfied with their roles as wives and mothers, and were looking for ways to try to branch out into the workforce and find more productive and maybe fulfilling lives. Although certainly there are certainly more than tons of different women out there who are very satisfied as wives and mothers. The book was not suggesting that every single female could not be a stay-at-home mother, but rather that the opportunity should be presented to everyone to do something else if they so choose. The book was an enormous success, sold 3 million copies in 3 years, and really launched what would later become dubbed by historians as the second wave of feminism. Now, one of the things that is really important to understanding this part of American history, especially the 1960s and early 1970s, is that sort of in the lead up to the Civil War, in the same way that we saw things like prison reform, education reform, and even women's suffrage back then get fueled by the overall drive for abolitionism. You see something similar in the 1960s and 1970s, where you have a bunch of different reform movements going on. In this case, in the 1960s, we're talking about things like the civil rights movement, and especially protests against the Vietnam War. A lot of these same people are working in all three areas. So there's a lot of cross movement between, say, Vietnam protests and the feminist movement and the civil rights movement. And then even later, we'll get into the environmental movement and the LGBTQ movement as well. At the end of the day, if you want to know, okay, well, what distinguishes second wave feminism from first wave feminism is Betty Friedan in the second wave feminism was really arguing for a reevaluation of traditional gender roles in society and an end to sex-based discrimination. And I'll get into more what that means in a second. And it's important to note that, again, what distinguishes that from first wave feminism was that first wave feminism was really tied up in the idea of women's suffrage, the idea that women should get the right to vote. It wasn't per se looking for a reevaluation of gender roles. So, moving forward, it is important to note that during the Vietnam War, anti war protests tend to overshadow the growing feminist movement. But in the 1970s, as the war in Vietnam grounds to a halt, that ends. And so, feminism, or as it is also called, women's liberation, gained strength as a political force in the 1970s. And this is when we see some key leaders. Friedan I've already discussed, Gloria Steinem, whose picture is there, and Bella Abzug found what's called the National Women's Political Caucus in 1971. This came after NOW, which is the National Organization for Women, which is in 1966. So those are both advocacy groups. Those are both groups who are attempting to shepherd through political changes by putting pressure on different politicians and political groups, almost in the exact same way that different civil rights groups like the SCLC or NAACP did when we come to civil rights. So you need to see those organizations in this sort of similar way. And they had a lot of success. A couple of things happened. There was the Equal Pay Act in 1963. This was enormous. This Equal Pay Act is essentially a labor law that prohibited gender-based discrimination in the United States. Kennedy signed it in 1963 as an amendment to the Fair Labor Standards Act. And this mandated equal pay for equal work, forbidding employers from paying men and women different wages or benefits for doing the exact same jobs and responsibilities. It's crazy to think about, but prior to the Equal Pay Act in 1963, an employer could, if they wanted to, say, I am going to pay a female employee less because she is a female. This put the end to that notion. And this was followed up by successes in the other branches of government, really specifically in the judicial branch. There's a couple of really important cases that come down at the same time, showing the muscle that the feminist movement is able to flex. Most importantly are Griswold versus Connecticut and Roe v. Wade. Roe v. Wade is probably the case that most of us are familiar with, which codified women's reproductive rights up until the recent overturning of Roe v. Wade in the Dobbs decision. Griswold versus Connecticut, though, is just as important if it's not talked about as frequently, not for the least reason of which is because it relies on somewhat similar legal groundwork as Roe v. Wade. And if Roe v. Wade is overturned, then perhaps Griswold is next on the chopping block. No one is to say, but it's certainly possible. In Griswold versus Connecticut, this is a contraception case. And so Connecticut had a law that outlawed contraception. So we're talking about things like birth control pills, condoms, et cetera, et cetera. And the Supreme Court ruled that people have a right to privacy and therefore have a right to purchase contraception for their own use if they would like it to do so. And that has been the law ever since. That was a really important law in the development of the feminist movement, and especially the second wave feminist movement. But they didn't get everything that they wanted. Congress passed an Equal Rights Amendment in 1972, but unfortunately, that amendment has not been ratified by the states. It's actually still pending. It needs one more state to sign off on it, and then we would have what's called an Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution. What would that amendment be, you may ask? Well, the Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution would essentially say you are constitutionally prohibited from discriminating against people on the basis of sex. We already have one of those for the basis of race, ethnicity, national origin, so on and so forth. But we don't actually have one for sex. Now, some Supreme Court justices and legal scholars will argue that it is implied in the 14th Amendment that you cannot discriminate on the basis of sex. However, not everyone agrees with that. And other judges and legal scholars argue that no, technically there's nothing in the Constitution that prevents someone from discriminating against a female or a male for their sex. It's an issue that continues to percolate still today. All right. Now, like the suffrage movement in the 19-teens, second wave feminism was criticized somewhat for centering more on white women. And so some Black women were able to form their own feminist organizations to try to achieve their own goal. The most prominent of these was the National Black Feminist Organization, or the NBFO. Despite all the achievements of second wave feminism, this movement began to lose momentum by about 1980. And once conservative forces sweep Ronald Reagan into the White House, most historians declare second wave feminism to be over.